The first call came at 10:47 p.m. The second came less than a minute later. Then another. And another. By 11:15 my phone screen looked like it was having a seizure. 23 missed calls. 14 voicemails. 37 text messages. All from the same man. The same man who just hours earlier had told me never to contact him again. The same man who had written, "Don't call or come over again, we're done. And don't even think about the will, sweetie." I remember sitting on my back porch in North Carolina, still wearing my Army uniform pants and a faded gray t-shirt, staring at the endless notifications lighting up my screen. The night air smelled like wet grass. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. And for the first time in years I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because I finally understood something. My father thought he had just won. What he didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. And before midnight he was going to realize it. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old. I'm a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army. For almost 20 years I believed that if I worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, and loved my family enough, eventually my father would see me. Not my rank. Not my accomplishments. Not the money I quietly spent helping them. Me. I was wrong. The strange thing about favoritism is that the favored child often doesn't notice it. But the other child notices every single time. Every birthday. Every holiday. Every family gathering. Every conversation. I noticed all of them. My older brother Ryan was 3 years older than me. Growing up, he could do no wrong. If Ryan got a C, Dad said school was unfair. If I got an A, Dad asked why it wasn't an A+. If Ryan crashed a car, it was bad luck. If I forgot to call for 2 days during military training, I was selfish. The rules were always different. The older I got, the more obvious it became. My father never hated me. That would have almost been easier. He simply valued Ryan more. And somehow that hurt worse. When I enlisted at 18, Dad acted as though I had personally betrayed him. "You're throwing your life away," he told me. "You could work with family." I still remember standing in our driveway with a duffel bag over my shoulder. "I need to do this." "No," he said. "You want to do this." Those words stayed with me for years. Because he was right. I did want it. I wanted purpose. I wanted challenge. I wanted a life bigger than our small town. The Army gave me all of that. It also taught me something my father never did. Respect has to be earned. Over the years, I deployed overseas multiple times, missed holidays, missed birthdays, missed weddings. I spent anniversaries sleeping in tents and Christmas mornings in combat zones. But every time I came home, I tried to reconnect with my family, especially my parents. I called every week, sent gifts, visited whenever I could. And when money became a problem, I helped. Quietly, without asking for recognition. When Mom needed surgery, I paid the portion insurance didn't cover. When the roof leaked, I wrote a check. When Dad's truck died, I replaced it. Every single time they accepted the help, but gratitude never lasted long, especially with Dad. Because somehow Ryan always needed more. Ryan was 50 kinds of charming and 1 kind of irresponsible. Businesses failed. Jobs disappeared. Relationships exploded. Credit cards maxed out. Yet every disaster somehow became somebody else's fault. And every time he fell, Dad rushed to catch him. The rest of us were expected to applaud. 3 weeks before everything fell apart, Dad called a family meeting. That alone was unusual. Dad hated family meetings. According to him, families should simply listen, not discuss, not debate. Listen. I drove 3 hours to attend. When I arrived, Ryan was already there. Mom looked nervous. Dad looked determined, which meant trouble. Dinner barely lasted 15 minutes before he got to the point. "I've made some decisions about the future." Nobody spoke. Dad folded his hands. "The estate will go to Ryan." Just like that. No explanation. No discussion. Ryan smirked. Mom stared at her plate. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Everything I asked." Dad nodded. "Everything." I sat quietly for a moment. Then asked the question nobody else would. "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because he needs it." I almost laughed. Ryan was 41 years old, not 14. He needs it because he keeps making terrible decisions. Dad slammed his palm on the table. "There you go." "There I go, what?" "Judging your brother." I stared at him. "Dad, you've paid his debts for 20 years. He's family. So am I." The room went silent. Dad looked away first. That hurt more than anything he could have said, because it answered the question. So I stood, picked up my keys, and left. The next morning I woke up to the text. No phone call. No conversation. No attempt to fix things. Just words. Cold. Final. Don't call or come over again. We're done. And don't even think about the will, sweetie. Sweetie. That word annoyed me more than the rest. Like I was still 10 years old. Like he was dismissing me with a pat on the head. I read it twice, then smiled, and replied, "Yes, sir. Nothing else. No argument. No defense. No anger. Just 2 words." Then I put my phone down. For the first time in my life, I stopped chasing my father's approval. The silence that followed felt strange, almost uncomfortable, then surprisingly peaceful. I spent the rest of the day cleaning my house, organizing closets, sorting paperwork, doing all the small tasks people ignore when they're emotionally exhausted. Late that afternoon, I opened a storage box I hadn't touched in years. Most of it contained military records, old photographs, letters from deployments, memories. Then I found a large yellow envelope. My stomach tightened instantly. I knew exactly what it was. The envelope my grandfather had given me 15 years earlier. The one he told me never to lose. The one I had promised to keep safe. I sat down slowly. Outside rain tapped softly against the windows. For several moments I simply stared at the envelope resting in my lap. I hadn't opened it in years. Hadn't even thought about it recently. But now something felt different. Something felt important. Almost urgent. I ran my fingers across Grandpa's handwriting. My chest tightened with memories. Of fishing trips, Sunday breakfasts, long talks on his porch. He had always understood me in a way nobody else did, especially my father. And suddenly I remembered something he had told me during our final conversation. One sentence, one warning. At the time it had seemed strange. Now it felt like a message waiting to be understood. I looked at the envelope again. Then at the growing pile of missed calls beginning to appear on my phone. The first few were from Mom, then Ryan, then Dad, again. And again, and again. I didn't answer. Instead, I carefully opened the envelope. And what I found inside made me realize my father had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. The envelope smelled faintly of old paper and cedar wood. For a moment, I was no longer sitting alone in my house. I was 23 years old again, standing beside my grandfather's hospital bed. The memory arrived so vividly that I could almost hear the steady beep of the heart monitor. Almost feel the cold hospital air against my skin. Back then, I had just finished officer candidate school. I was young, determined, and convinced that hard work could solve almost anything. My grandfather had asked everyone else to leave the room. My father, my mother, Ryan, even the nurses. When the door closed, he motioned for me to come closer. His hands looked thinner than I remembered. Age and illness had taken their toll, but his eyes were still sharp, still strong, still the eyes of a man who had spent his life building something that mattered. "Emily," he said quietly. "Yes, Grandpa. There's something I need you to do for me." I remember pulling a chair closer. "You name it." A faint smile crossed his face. "You always say that." "Because I mean it." For several seconds, he simply looked at me. Then he reached into the drawer beside his bed and removed a large yellow envelope. The same envelope now sitting in my hands 15 years later. "I want you to keep this." "What is it?" "You'll know when the time comes." I laughed softly. "That sounds mysterious." "It is." The smile disappeared. His expression turned serious. "Very serious?" Then he said something I never forgot. "One day your father's choices will destroy this family." At the time, I thought the medication was affecting him. My father and grandfather had always argued. Nothing unusual there. But now, 15 years later, those words echoed differently. Like a warning. Like a prediction. Like a man who knew exactly what was coming. Back in the present, I carefully removed the documents from the envelope. The first several pages looked familiar. Property records, tax filings, business agreements. Nothing dramatic. At least not at first glance. I kept reading. Page after page. My military training had taught me patience. Details matter. Small things become big things when people ignore them. By the 20th page, I stopped breathing for a second. Then I read the paragraph again. And again. Because surely I had misunderstood. But I hadn't. The family land wasn't legally my father's. Not completely. In fact, a large portion of what everyone referred to as Dad's property had never actually belonged to him. The ownership structure was far more complicated. Grandpa had established a family trust decades earlier. Most of the assets had been transferred into that trust. Dad had been named trustee, manager, caretaker, not owner. That distinction changed everything. I leaned back in my chair. Outside rain continued falling against the windows. Inside, my heartbeat felt louder than the storm. I kept reading. The deeper I went, the more uncomfortable I became. because suddenly dozens of events from the past 20 years started making sense. Dad had always acted like the family assets belonged to him. Completely. Absolutely. But legally that wasn't true. His authority came with conditions, responsibilities, restrictions. And according to these documents, Grandpa had been extremely specific. One clause immediately caught my attention. I read it 3 times, then a 4th. The language was clear. If the trustee used family assets primarily to benefit one heir at the expense of others, if the trustee violated fiduciary responsibilities, if the trustee demonstrated favoritism that endangered the long-term interests of the family trust, then oversight authority could be transferred, not automatically, but through legal review. I stared at the name listed beneath that clause. My name, Emily Carter. For several moments I simply sat there, motionless. The room suddenly felt smaller. I wasn't shocked because I might inherit something. I genuinely didn't care about the money. What shocked me was that Grandpa had anticipated this exact situation 15 years ago, long before the latest fight, long before the text message, long before tonight. He had seen something everyone else ignored. Something I had spent years pretending wasn't real. My father's favoritism. I closed my eyes, and memories came flooding back. Ryan's failed construction company. Dad using family funds to bail him out. Ryan's second business. Another rescue. Ryan's divorce. Dad paying legal fees. Ryan's tax problems. Dad handling those too. Every crisis. Every mistake. Every bailout. At the time I dismissed it as parental loyalty. Now I wasn't so sure. I turned another page, then another. My stomach dropped. There were financial summaries, detailed ones. Grandpa had apparently ordered independent audits during the final years of his life. Several notes had been attached, handwritten, meticulous, concerned. One note stood out. Repeated transfers without proportional benefit to trust beneficiaries. Another, excessive support provided to Ryan Carter. And another, potential future risk if pattern continues. I rubbed my forehead. This wasn't just favoritism. This was documentation. Evidence. Years of it. Suddenly my phone buzzed again. Dad. Calling. I let it ring. Then another call. Ryan. Ignored. Then Mom. Ignored. For the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in defending myself. I wanted answers. At nearly midnight, I found the final section. A sealed letter addressed specifically to me. My hands shook slightly as I unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakably Grandpa's. Emily, if you're reading this, then one of 2 things has happened. Either your father finally learned fairness, or he didn't. I smiled despite myself. That sounded exactly like him. I kept reading. You will be tempted to protect people who refuse to protect you. You always have been. That is one of your greatest strengths, and one of your greatest weaknesses. The words hit harder than I expected, because they were true, painfully true. I had spent years helping people who rarely appreciated it. Years earning love that should have been freely given. The letter continued. Do not confuse kindness with surrender. Do not confuse loyalty with obedience. And do not allow guilt to make decisions that wisdom should make. By the time I reached the final paragraph, my eyes were burning. Not from sadness, from understanding. The last sentence stopped me cold. When the time comes, call Richard. He'll know what to do. Richard. I knew exactly who that was. Richard Holloway. Grandpa's attorney. The man who had handled nearly every legal matter in our family for over 40 years. The man Dad rarely spoke about anymore. The man I hadn't seen since Grandpa's funeral. I glanced at the clock. 12:07 a.m. Far too late for a call. At least for most people. But Richard had always been different. I searched through old contacts. To my surprise, his number was still there. My thumb hovered over the screen. For a moment I hesitated. Making that call felt like crossing a line. Like stepping into a future I couldn't yet see. Then my phone vibrated again. Dad. Calling for the 8th time. A text arrived seconds later. Emily. Please call me. Another appeared. We need to talk. Then another. It's important. I stared at those messages. The same man who had disowned me less than 24 hours earlier suddenly wanted a conversation. Interesting. Very interesting. I set the phone down. Then dialed Richard Holloway. The call connected on the second ring. A tired voice answered. Hello, Mr. Holloway. A pause. Then recognition. Emily. Yes, sir. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Almost as if he had been expecting this moment. Finally, he exhaled slowly. and said words that sent a chill through my entire body. I've been waiting years for this phone call. For a few seconds after Richard spoke, neither of us said anything. Rain continued tapping against my windows. The digital clock beside the couch glowed 12:09 a.m. And somewhere deep inside me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years began to stir. Not anger. Not revenge. Certainty. The kind that arrives when scattered pieces finally start fitting together. Richard cleared his throat. Do you have the envelope? Yes. All of it. I think so. No, he said quietly. You don't think so. You need to know so. I looked down at the document spread across my coffee table. Then yes. Good. The relief in his voice was unmistakable, as though he had spent years worried those papers might disappear, or be destroyed, or never be found at all. Your grandfather trusted you, he continued. More than Dad. A soft sigh came through the phone. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. Richard was silent, which told me everything. He asked me to scan several pages and send them immediately. By 2 a.m, we were still reviewing documents. By 3, he had confirmed what I already suspected. The trust was real. The conditions were real. The violations were potentially very real. And my father had absolutely no idea. When I finally climbed into bed, the sun was only a few hours away. My phone contained 38 missed calls. I slept anyway, better than I had in years. The next morning began with another message from Dad. Emily, call me. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what he'd written. Just a demand disguised as a request. I didn't answer. Instead, I made coffee and drove to Richard's office. His building sat on a quiet street 2 towns away. The same red brick structure it had been for decades. When I walked inside, Richard looked older than I remembered. His hair had turned almost completely white. His shoulders seemed thinner. But his eyes were still sharp. Very sharp. He greeted me with a handshake, then immediately got to work. For 6 hours, we reviewed records, financial statements, property transfers, trust reports, tax documents, correspondence. The deeper we dug, the worse things looked. Not because my father had stolen money. He hadn't. At least not in the criminal sense. The problem was something else. Something more complicated. For years, he had treated trust assets like a personal safety net for Ryan. Whenever Ryan failed, trust resources appeared. Whenever Ryan struggled, trust resources appeared. Whenever Ryan made another terrible decision, trust resources appeared again. The pattern stretched back nearly 15 years, one rescue after another, one exception after another, one justification after another. By late afternoon, Richard removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. I've spent 42 years practicing law. That long. Unfortunately. I smiled. He didn't. Emily, I've seen a lot of families destroy themselves. The room grew quiet. But this? He tapped a thick stack of papers. This wasn't about money. I knew exactly what he meant. Because he was right. The money was simply the symptom. The real disease was favoritism. Years of it. Decades of it. And everyone around my father had been forced to adapt. Mom learned not to argue. Ryan learned not to take responsibility. And I learned to expect disappointment. The following week brought more discoveries. Some painful. Some almost absurd. Meanwhile, my father continued calling. Every day. Sometimes multiple times. I never answered. Not because I wanted revenge. Because for once I wanted the truth before the conversation. And every day his messages became more desperate. Please call me. We need to clear this up. This has gone too far. Emily, answer your phone. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years I had been the one chasing him. Now the roles were reversed. One afternoon Richard called. I need you to see something. An hour later I was sitting across from him again. He slid a folder toward me. Inside was a copy of a proposed sales agreement. I frowned. What is this? The family land. My stomach tightened. Several hundred acres. The property Grandpa had spent most of his life building. The property every family gathering revolved around. The property Dad swore would stay in the family forever. They were selling it. Or trying to. I continued reading. A development company. Luxury housing project. Multi-million-dollar transaction. Projected closing date. 3 weeks away. I looked up. Does Ryan know? Richard laughed. Not because it was funny. Because the answer was obvious. Ryan helped arrange it. Of course he did. I leaned back. The disappointment hit harder than anger. Because despite everything, I had still hoped there were limits. Apparently there weren't. The next few days felt surreal. Word spread quickly through town. People began congratulating Dad. Congratulating Ryan. Talking about the deal. Talking about the future. Talking about the money. Then came the barbecue. The celebration. The party that would eventually become one of the most humiliating moments of my father's life. I wasn't invited. That detail surprised exactly nobody, but several people who attended later told me what happened. Dad stood in the backyard holding a drink. Ryan beside him. Friends and relatives everywhere. And for the first time in years, they looked victorious. Like men who had finally won. One guest eventually asked about me. According to 3 different witnesses, Dad laughed. Actually laughed. Then said, "She chose the army over family." Someone asked if I would challenge the sale. Dad shook his head. Number. The confidence in that single word was astonishing. He doesn't know, Richard said when I later told him. Number. He really doesn't. And that was the problem. My father wasn't being malicious anymore. He was being careless. Careless people eventually make mistakes, big ones. A week before the scheduled closing, Richard finished the final review. The conclusion was devastating. The trust violations were undeniable, documented, extensive, legally actionable. For several minutes, I simply stared out his office window. Cars passed below. People walked sidewalks. Life continued normally. Yet I knew mine was about to change. "Do you want to proceed?" Richard asked. I didn't answer immediately, because despite everything, this was still my father. The man who taught me how to ride a bike. The man who attended my high school graduation. The man who once carried me into the house after I fell asleep in the truck. People are rarely all good or all bad. That's what makes family so complicated. Finally, I looked at Richard. "What happens if I do nothing?" He didn't hesitate. "The sale moves forward. And after that, the trust may be damaged beyond repair." I nodded slowly. The answer wasn't difficult anymore. It was simply painful. 3 days later, official notices were prepared. Legal reviews were completed. Emergency motions were ready. Every document sat neatly inside a black leather folder. Waiting. The closing date arrived on a bright Thursday morning. The kind of morning that feels too peaceful for disaster. I woke before sunrise, put on my army dress uniform, pressed every crease, polished every button. Not because I wanted attention, because Grandpa would have expected professionalism. By 8:30, I was standing outside my house, the black folder under my arm, my phone buzzing again. Dad. Calling. I silenced it, then climbed into my car. An hour later, I pulled into the parking lot outside the law offices where the sale would be finalized. Luxury SUVs filled the lot. Investors had arrived. Bank representatives had arrived. Developers had arrived. And inside that building, my father was probably smiling, certain he had already won. I stepped out of the car, adjusted my uniform jacket, picked up the folder, and walked toward the entrance. Because in just a few minutes, everyone inside was about to learn something my grandfather had known for 15 years. The wrong person had been in control all along. The receptionist looked up as I entered the building. For half a second, I saw confusion cross her face, then recognition, then surprise. Not because of who I was, because of what I was wearing. Army dress blues have a way of changing a room before a single word is spoken. People notice. They straighten up. They look twice. Not out of fear, out of curiosity. I thanked her politely and followed the directions to the conference room. As I approached the closed door, I could already hear voices inside. Laughter. Confident laughter. The kind people make when they think everything has already been decided. I paused for 1 second. Not because I was nervous. Because I was remembering my grandfather. His porch. His voice. The envelope. The warning. Then I opened the door. The room immediately fell silent. Every head turned. My father's smile disappeared first. Ryan's disappeared second. Several investors looked confused. A banker adjusted his glasses. One of the attorneys frowned slightly. Nobody had expected me. Especially not my father. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Dad pushed his chair back. Hard. "What are you doing here?" His voice carried across the room. I calmly closed the door behind me. "Good morning, Dad. I asked you a question." I heard it. His face reddened. "I told you not to come." The words hung in the air. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. I looked directly at him, then smiled. Not mockingly, not cruelly, just calmly. "I'm not here as your daughter." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ryan stared at me. Dad blinked. "What does that even mean?" Before I could answer, another voice came from behind me. "Perhaps I can explain." Richard entered the room, carrying 3 large binders. The moment my father saw him, something changed. Only slightly. But I noticed the confidence wasn't completely gone. Yet, however, a crack had appeared. A very small crack. Richard walked to the table, placed the binders down, and sat. "Richard," Dad said, "what is this?" An issue that should have been addressed years ago. The room grew even quieter. One investor looked at another. The banker stopped reviewing documents. People could sense something was wrong. They just didn't know how wrong. Dad laughed nervously. "This isn't the time." "Actually," Richard replied, "it's exactly the time." The attorney representing the development company spoke up. "Is there a problem with the transaction?" Richard nodded. "Yes." That single word changed the atmosphere immediately. Every person in the room became alert. Pens stopped moving. Papers stopped turning. The room shifted from celebration to caution. Dad crossed his arms. "Richard, enough." "Number." The answer came instantly, firmly. The kind of firmness that only comes from someone who knows they're standing on solid ground. Then Richard opened the first binder. "My responsibility today is not to protect anyone's feelings." He looked directly at my father. "My responsibility is to protect the trust." The trust. Several people frowned. The developers looked confused. One banker immediately started taking notes. Dad's expression hardened. "There's no issue with the trust." Richard opened a document. "There is." Then another. "And there has been for years." Ryan finally jumped in. "This is ridiculous." Richard didn't even look at him. Instead, he continued turning pages, one document after another, one financial record after another, one transfer after another. The evidence piled up slowly, methodically, relentlessly. No dramatic speeches, no shouting. Just facts, which are often far more dangerous. Within 15 minutes, the atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The investors no longer looked excited. They looked concerned. The banker no longer looked relaxed. He looked worried. And my father looked increasingly uncomfortable. Then Richard revealed the trust agreement. The original version, signed decades earlier. The room became completely silent. He explained how ownership had been structured, how authority had been delegated, how fiduciary responsibilities worked, how trust assets were supposed to be protected. The developer's attorney interrupted. "Are you saying Mr. Carter does not own these properties outright?" Richard nodded. "Correct?" The man froze. "So who does?" Richard slowly turned toward me. Every eye in the room followed. The silence felt endless. Then Richard spoke. "The trust beneficiaries." Another pause. "And under specific conditions, oversight authority transfers to Lieutenant Colonel Emily Carter." Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Dad looked stunned. Ryan looked confused. The investors looked alarmed. The banker looked like he suddenly wished he were somewhere else. What Ryan finally said. Richard calmly handed over copies. Nobody argued anymore, because now there was documentation, signatures, legal records, evidence. The conversation changed immediately. Questions started flying. Dates, transactions, conditions, reviews, responsibilities. The developers looked increasingly uneasy. One banker stepped outside to make a phone call. Another attorney began reading faster. Very fast. The celebration was over. Dad stared at me. "How long?" His voice sounded different now. Smaller. "How long have you known?" I held his gaze. "Long enough." His jaw tightened. "Long enough for what?" "Long enough to give you every chance to do the right thing." Those words hit him harder than anything else said that morning. I could see it. Because he knew they were true. For years I had given him chances. Hundreds of them. Probably thousands. I had tolerated insults, dismissals, favoritism, disrespect. Not because I was weak. Because I kept hoping. Hoping one day he would choose fairness. One day he would choose family over pride. One day he would see me. Instead he sent a text message. And accidentally started the collapse of everything he thought he controlled. Ryan slammed both hands on the table. "This is your fault." The accusation echoed through the room. Several people looked embarrassed for him. I simply watched. "Mine. You planned this." "Number." "Yes, you did." "No, Ryan." For the first time all morning my voice became slightly harder. "I didn't create this situation." I looked directly at him. "You did." His face reddened instantly. Because deep down he knew. Every bailout, every rescue, every excuse, every special treatment. All of it had led here. Nobody else. Him. The final blow came 30 minutes later. The bank formally suspended participation. The development company postponed closing indefinitely. The transaction could not legally proceed until the trust dispute was resolved. Millions of dollars froze instantly. The room felt colder, heavier. Final. The sale was dead. At least for now. Nobody celebrated. Not even me. Because despite everything, victory didn't feel the way people imagine. It wasn't exciting. It wasn't satisfying. It was sad. Watching your father lose isn't enjoyable, even when he's the one who caused it. Especially then. By noon, the meeting was effectively over. People began leaving. Quietly. Awkwardly. Nobody wanted to be there anymore. One by one, they disappeared. Until only a handful remained. Ryan left first. Angry. Humiliated. Blaming everyone except himself. The same pattern he had followed his entire life. Then Mom left. Tears in her eyes. Unable to look at anyone. Finally, only Dad remained. Standing beside the conference table. Looking older than he had that morning. Much older. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question. Not as a businessman. Not as a father. Just as a man. Was I really that unfair? The room suddenly felt very quiet. I thought about lying. Making it easier. Softer. Kinder. Instead, I told him the truth. Yes. The single word landed like a stone. Dad looked down. For the first time in my life, he had no argument. No defense. No explanation. Just silence. A few moments later, he picked up his coat, turned toward the door, and walked away. Not angry. Not shouting. Not blaming. Simply defeated. The man who had controlled every family conversation for decades left without saying another word. And as the door closed behind him, I realized something important. The real consequences hadn't started yet, because sooner or later he was going to go home and finally sit alone with the truth. I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The meeting had ended. The sale had collapsed. The truth was finally out. But families don't unravel in conference rooms. They unravel afterward. In kitchens. In living rooms. In late-night phone calls. In quiet moments when people are left alone with consequences. That evening I drove home with the radio off. The black folder sat on the passenger seat beside me. Sunlight stretched across the highway. Traffic moved steadily. Everything looked normal. Yet nothing felt normal. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of proving myself to my father. The burden was gone. And strangely enough, that felt heavier before it felt lighter. I arrived home around 6, fed my dog, changed clothes, made coffee I didn't need, then sat on the back porch. The same place where this whole chapter had truly begun. The air was warm. The sky glowed orange and purple. Crickets chirped in the distance. Peaceful, until my phone buzzed. Dad? I stared at the screen. Didn't answer. A minute later it buzzed again. Dad. Again. Then again. Then Ryan. Then Mom. Then Dad. Then Ryan. By 9 o'clock the calls were coming every few minutes. By 10 they became almost constant. Voicemails started arriving. One after another. I listened to Ryan's first. Emily, call me. The second sounded less confident. Look, this got blown out of proportion. The third was angry. The fourth was desperate. The fifth was almost pathetic. For years, Ryan had always assumed somebody would rescue him. Dad. Mom. Sometimes even me. Now there was nobody left. The system that protected him had collapsed, and he had no idea what to do. Around 10:30, I listened to a voicemail from Mom. Her voice cracked almost immediately. Please call me sweetheart. I closed my eyes. Mom had spent most of her life trying to keep peace between people who refused to change. That role ages a person. I knew she was hurting, but I also knew something else. Keeping peace and fixing problems are not the same thing. For decades, she had confused the two. The phone buzzed again. Dad. Again. I ignored it. At 11:15, another message appeared. Then another. Then another. The man who once took days to return calls was suddenly sending messages every 15 minutes. The irony wasn't lost on me. Finally, just before midnight, a text arrived. Not a demand. Not an accusation. Not an order. Just 4 words. Can we talk? I stared at the screen. For a long time. Then another message appeared. Please. That word hit differently. Because I honestly couldn't remember the last time my father had used it with me. Not as a formality. Not as a habit. But sincerely. I didn't answer that night. Or the next morning. Or the next day. Sometimes people need time to understand what happened. And my father had spent nearly 40 years believing he was right. That kind of belief doesn't disappear overnight. 3 days later, I finally called him. The silence after he answered lasted several seconds. Then he spoke. Emily. His voice sounded tired. Older. Smaller. Hi, Dad. Another pause. I didn't think you'd call. I looked out my kitchen window. Neither did I. Where are you? I asked. Home. His voice cracked slightly. The house feels awfully quiet. I knew exactly what he meant. For years, noise had protected him. Activity, control, distractions. Now all he had was reflection. We agreed to meet the following afternoon. Not at his house. Not at mine. A small diner halfway between our towns. Neutral ground. The kind of place where nobody holds home field advantage. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting alone in a booth, coffee untouched, looking out the window. For a moment, I barely recognized him. Not physically, emotionally. The certainty was gone. The authority was gone. The armor was gone. He looked like a man carrying something heavy. I sat across from him. Neither of us spoke immediately. Finally, he looked up. "I owe you an apology." I waited. Because apologies are easy. Accountability is harder. He nodded slowly, as though understanding exactly what I was thinking. Then he surprised me. He didn't defend himself, not once. Instead, he told the truth, the whole truth. About Ryan, about guilt, about fear, about mistakes. After Grandpa died, he had convinced himself Ryan needed protection. Then more protection. Then even more. Eventually, helping Ryan became his identity. And somewhere along the way, he stopped noticing the damage. Or maybe he noticed and chose not to see it. Sometimes those are the same thing. The hardest moment came when he looked directly at me and said, "You never needed me." I shook my head. "That's not true." "It is." "No, Dad." My voice softened. "I needed you." The pain on his face was immediate, visible, real. Then why didn't I see it? For several seconds I couldn't answer. Because the truth was complicated. Because people rarely become who they are overnight. Finally I said, "Because you were too busy worrying about the child who kept falling to notice the one who learned how to stand." His eyes filled with tears, actual tears. I had seen my father cry exactly twice in my life. At Grandpa's funeral. And now, the diner became very quiet. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. Some moments deserve space. This was one of them. Eventually, he looked down at his hands. "I thought you'd come back no matter what." There it was. The truth beneath all the other truths. Not favoritism. Not money. Not even Ryan. Entitlement. He believed my love was guaranteed. Unconditional. Permanent. No matter how poorly he treated it. And for years he had been right. Until he wasn't. I reached across the table. Not because everything was fixed. Because some bridges deserve an opportunity to be rebuilt. Even slowly. Even carefully. "I'm not angry anymore," he nodded. "But things can't go back to the way they were." Another nod. This one heavier. "I know." And for the first time I believed him. Over the next year our relationship changed. Not magically. Not perfectly. Slowly. The way real healing happens. Ryan eventually got a job. Kept it. For once. Mom stopped trying to manage everyone else's emotions. Dad started listening more than talking. And I finally stopped carrying responsibilities that never belonged to me. The trust remained protected. The land remained in the family. And together with Richard I established something Grandpa would have loved. A scholarship fund for military families. Every year it helps young men and women pursue education and service. Every year Grandpa's name lives on. Exactly the way he deserved. About 13 months after the meeting, I received a text message on my birthday. Simple. No speeches. No drama. No conditions. Just one sentence. "I'm proud of you, kid." I stared at the screen for a long time, then smiled. Not because the words fixed the past. They didn't. Nothing can. But because they arrived honestly. Finally, after all those years, I put the phone down, looked out toward the evening sky, and continued living the life I had built myself. Not because my father finally approved, but because I had learned something much more important. Your worth does not begin when someone recognizes it. Your worth was there all along. And sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving people wrong. It's finally stopping the need to prove anything at all. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to walk away from someone you loved in order to protect your peace? Let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. We share new stories every day. And if you enjoy heartfelt family dramas like this one, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Until next time, take care of yourselves and the people who truly value you.